Hi everyone, I'm Maria Genoviak. I am the Deputy Director of the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and also the coordinator for the New England Climate Change Response Framework Project. And what I want to do today is give you a presentation about climate change and its effects on Northeast forests, and particularly those in Northern New York and New England. During this presentation, I'll describe some of the observed climate trends over the past century, how climate change is expected to occur in the future, what projected changes we expect to see, and what the impacts are to tree species and forest ecosystems in this region. More information about this presentation and additional resources are available at our website for the Climate Change Response Framework, which is www.forestadaptation.org, and specifically on the New England page for additional resources related to this region. If you go to the homepage, there's a lot more general to a lot of different natural resource topics. The information in this presentation is from a vulnerability assessment and synthesis that we prepared for this region. You can see on the map there, Northern New York and New England. We've prepared a series of these reports for natural resource professionals of all the areas shaded in blue on the figure. And the focus of these assessment documents is to examine how a range of future conditions of what is projected to change in the future will impact forest ecosystems, to really summarize the information for natural resource professionals, evaluate key ecosystem vulnerabilities. They don't make recommendations. These documents are really intended to summarize the state of the science and allow that to serve as a starting point for people being able to incorporate this information into their work, but we don't provide any sort of recommendation on what you should do with your management. That we do through other resources like the forest adaptation resources. So really just to start with, we know that the climate is changing, and typically this is often called climate change. During most of my presentation, I'll talk about it as climate change, but it's also called global warming. And so I thought it would be good to start there with the topic of global warming and really think about how has the global climate system warmed in the past several centuries, several decades. And we can see that looking at global temperatures, we see this really pronounced increase in global temperatures measured, by all sorts of different instruments across the world, that we're seeing substantial increases in temperature since the industrial era as a result of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. And this is really becoming more and more evident, more and more rapid. And so we see that, 18 of the 19 warmest years have all occurred since 2001. The exception was 1998. So all of the most recent years, record-breaking temperature years, have happened within the past 20 or 30 years. So this is really substantial. We can see this increase. We see the same trends when we look at nationally. The temperature isn't warming equally in all places, but when we think about places like the northeastern United States, we're definitely seeing warming temperatures by several degrees over the last century in all seasons. So nationally, regionally, that means warmer in all seasons and more days with extreme heat. We can break this down a little bit more and think about what it means in this particular region. So again, we can look at the trend in here. In this case, we have the record going back to about 1900. We can see that although there's interannual variability and little cycles and what happens from time to time, the overall trend has been for an increase in temperature. And we see that reflected in seasons, with winter being the warmest increase in temperature during the winter season, so December, January, February. And so that's really important when we think about ecosystems, and we'll talk more about that in future slides. But it's not just global warming, it's not just temperature change, which is why we really do talk about climate change. One of the ways we've really seen this in the Northeast has been in changes in precipitation. And so really what climate change looks like in New England, farther west, it's droughts, different things. But when we talk about the New England region, we're really talking about, changing precipitation dynamics, more precipitation throughout the year. So when we look at the annual average precipitation throughout the year, it's increased several more inches on the rate of 5 to 7 inches, depending on what time period and what study you look at. So much, much wetter when we look at annual precipitation. A lot of that is coming during more extreme rain events. And so the Northeast region has seen an increase in extreme rain events much more than other parts of the country. And so really what that looks like, these big rain events are really the hallmark of a changing climate in New England. And then greater variability throughout the year. And so because we have more rain falling, but some of it's during more extreme events, and then there's just interannual variability built in, that there's just enhanced variability in precipitation at all times of the year. There's a lot of other impacts too. So we talked about extreme rain events, but also extreme storms, sea level rise, coastal flooding, a variety of different impacts that are being seen across the region that are related and influenced by climate change. When we look at what's going to happen in the future, we look across a wide variety of climate models, different scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions to understand what the future might look like. And we've analyzed these different data sets and really tried to get a sense of what are we most confident in, what do we have the most evidence about. And so when we look at future climate changes, a lot of it's the trends I just described continuing into the future: warmer temperatures, a longer growing season, shorter, warmer winters, all associated with warmer temperatures. Sea level rise continued to increase across the regional and coastal areas. Altered precipitation patterns continuing with those intense precipitation events becoming really frequent, more severe. All of those, there's a really high level of evidence about, there's really high confidence when we look at the literature about those things happening. And so we can get into specifics, but really a lot of information available on all of those things. When we talk about altered soil moisture, it's a little bit harder to pin down exactly how precipitation is going and temperature changes are going to interact to influence soil moisture, but certainly we would expect it to change. Wetter parts of the year, we'd expect wetter soil moisture. Drier parts, we'd expect drier soil moisture. Makes a lot of sense, just not as much evidence when it comes to research that's been done to model these sorts of things, project them into the future. We also anticipate the potential for an increased risk of drought stress. I'll talk more about this later, but really thinking about the potential for maybe rainfall coming more periodic in these large events with these dry periods between and rising temperatures. And so there's this potential for drought stress during the growing season if we don't have increases in precipitation to counteract that. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But these are the general trends in terms of what's going to happen in the future. And what I'll do is talk in greater detail about these in terms of what they mean for forest ecosystems. So with those rises in temperature, we see potential for shorter, warmer winters. This is one of the impacts I said we're already seeing. The greatest warming occurred during the winter season, seeing decreases in winter severity, in snowfall, snow cover, snow depth. And these are all projected to continue into the future, such that we would expect 30 to 70% decreases in snowfall in a lot of parts of the region. Areas that currently don't receive a lot of snowfall, maybe not having snowfall or snow cover during much of the winter in the future. And some modeling points to the greatest losses being in December and January because the delay to the onset of the winter season. Now, when we think about how this affects ecosystems, affects forest management, one of the places that there's a lot of research, really interesting research emerging, is that decreasing snowpack reduces the insulating capacity, that insulating layer of snow that we get, and actually allows for increased soil frost, increased freezing of the soil, and also freeze-thaw dynamics. And so really changing the winter processes that are happening below ground, which can damage roots and just alter those ecosystem processes and dynamics that are occurring, just altering ecosystems fundamentally. We also see when we're talking about doing forestry practices that there's an increased potential for risk in the ability to do winter timber harvest. Often this is preferred because it reduces damage to forest soils, because there's this nice frozen soils or snowpack protecting soils. And so we might have a potential for inoperable conditions or less operable, less beneficial, I guess, less ideal conditions for winter harvest. Also, these tree species that are sensitive to soil freeze-thaw dynamics, like sugar maple, might be at greater risk as well. We, in addition to shorter winter that has less snow, we talked about increases in precipitation, and so that means typically that we can have less snow but more rain. Generally, when we look at projections, the precipitation during the cold season, the colder part of year, from late fall through winter into early spring is generally expected to increase. So we have warmer temperatures, we have increased precipitation during the cold season, leading to extreme rain events, and enhanced by extreme rain events. There's also the potential for earlier peak stream flows. This is something that's being observed in the region as well because of those shorter winters. It's essentially speeding up the hydrologic cycle, and so streams are becoming more active, rising earlier in the year. So what this means is that there's a lot of hydrologic change that comes about with climate change, and so we could have increased erosion or sedimentation where these dynamics are changing, where we maybe have increased rain events or rain on snow, rain on bare ground, I should say, culvert washouts and road damage from extreme events, and impacts on aquatic habitats and species. Along with the shortening of the winter season, the converse, the inverse of that is that we'll have a longer growing season. So we have warmer temperatures creating longer growing season. The growing season is already several weeks longer than it was 100 years ago, and there are changes being seen in things like when flowers flower or plants flower and when birds migrate. So we have evidence of these phenological shifts. And these are projected to increase another 3 to 7 or more weeks per year, depending on the different climate or emission scenario that we're using for a particular study. This is really fantastic in a lot of northern climates because it means that we could have a longer period for plant growth, which is definitely a good thing. There's also concerns, however, about phenological changes or mismatches. And so this is the idea that the timing of biological events are cued to different things. Some plants and animals are cued to day length, others to temperature. And so we might have relationships between things like plants and pollinators, or birds and insects, between when different species are cued to the timing of different events and when that happens. Another example would be, if you have an early spring, plants really open their buds sooner, maybe leaf out earlier, but we still get a late spring frost or late snow because of that climate variability, could cause damage to trees. There's a potential, as I alluded to earlier, about the increased risk of moisture stress. And again, this is something that I think people don't necessarily think much about in New England because it's been traditionally a very wet type of climate, adequate moisture under most years, drought being pretty rare, and we have this increasing annual precipitation. But there's this potential for moisture stress. So if we think about the water cycle within a forest, we can think about how water comes in to a forest ecosystem through precipitation, and then it can go a couple different places. It can be lost through runoff into streams or off-site. It can go and be recharged into groundwater, or it can be lost back, evaporate to the air from soils or surfaces, or the trees themselves can transpire and have water loss through their physiology as well. So if we think about this potential of longer and warmer growing seasons, we could end up with drier conditions. So first we have this earlier spring runoff that was discussed earlier, and that leading to increased, earlier spring rainfall, leading to increased runoff during extreme rain events. And so we have more water being lost through the system from from runoff because of that. We can then also end up with warmer temperatures are going to be driving water loss from soils and plants. And so really driving those water losses and pulling water from the trees, essentially sucking it out of them, and that can create the potential for moisture stress. So all changes aren't going to be necessarily greatest in all places. We could think about, sites that are maybe drought prone or have shallow soils, south-facing ridges being more vulnerable, more likely to experience these sorts of effects, as well as places where maybe we have tree species that are more mesic and like moisture conditions that are happening on drier sites. And so we get this, species that are maybe a little bit off-site or not on their optimal growing condition, and then growing conditions, and then a little bit of change can make it less ideal for them. Sea level rise is one that's definitely a concern for areas along the coast and inland areas that are affected by tides. Sea level has risen about a foot since 1900. It's actually risen more in the Northeast than other parts of the coast, which is interesting. Projections are of an additional 12 to 23 inches or more by end of century, depending on the data source that you use, but generally definitely continue an increase, and results again on coastal flooding and other impacts and saltwater intrusion, inundation to areas that are influenced by the sea level and coastal tidal dynamics. When we think about how this continues to affect forests, a lot of times we're talking about changes in forest composition and individual tree species, and this is something people are definitely interested in. So many northern boreal tree species that we associated with the North Woods or the northern forest are projected to decline in the region, and we are expecting to see those contract to more northerly or higher elevation locations. And as those species move south, there is the potential for those species move north and up. There is the potential for other species that are common farther south to see increased and new habitat in the region. So just to break this down a little bit more, we've used various modeling efforts like the Climate Change Tree Atlas and Landis models, other work to be able to provide information on what species are most likely to increase or decrease on the landscape when we talk about this particular region. Of course, it's highly variable from site to site, but when we look across the broad region, we look at the species that are expected to be most likely to decline. It is really those northern species, and particularly conifer species, and some of those kind of boreal far north species like aspen and paper birch. All these species really adapted to cold climate conditions, with traits like conical shapes that shed snow, white bark that prevents frost cracking. These tree species are really adapted to cold conditions, and so they're most competitive there. And having that lack of cold conditions means that they're going to be less suitable in areas that experience warming and greater amounts of warming, particularly. In contrast, we see a lot of potential for species that could be considered winners. They might do better, might be able to have expanded ranges. And these are a lot of hardwood species, particularly those that we think of as transition hardwood forests, maybe more in central and southern New England or farther south. Even the potential for some species that aren't currently present in the region to be able to have new suitability new habitat come into the region as conditions become more suitable for those species, if they're planted or if they somehow manage to make their way here. You'll see that on the slide there's a section for mixed model results and a few species listed, and these are places where generally the different models that we have some level of disagreement or nuance in terms of the results. This can be really frustrating because these are some of the most common and most important species in a lot of ecosystems, ones that people are really interested in terms of forest management. So typically what's happening for these tree species when we talk about American beech, sugar maple, yellow birch and white pine is that generally these species are expected to do okay and generally be able to persist if the climate warms just a little bit. Under more milder scenarios of climate warming, the species generally do pretty well and are able to maintain their current range. But when we have more extreme scenarios of harsher scenarios of climate warming, then we start to see a response where those species are negatively impacted and decline. The exception of this group is red maple, which is just a very difficult species for the models to be able to model because it is so competitive, so adaptable, it has so many traits. And so even though the models don't project that species to maybe increase too terribly much in the future, our knowledge of the species characteristics for red maple suggests that we would expect it to generally do well in a lot of situations just because it has so many highly adaptable traits that allow it to flourish in a range of conditions. Now, just because the species might decline, it doesn't mean that it's gone forever. And I think this is an important part when we talk about some of these species that might not fare better in the future. A species with a large decline might be projected to have something like a 50% reduction in suitable habitat over the next 100 years. This would be some of those northern species that I mentioned earlier. And so it's important to think that a 50% reduction in suitable habitat doesn't mean that the species is gone. It means that there's 50% less habitat. That habitat could be reduced equally where a species just becomes less abundant on the landscape overall, it's just less frequent. Or it could be where the habitat contracts to the best sites, where we would expect to see a species maybe in those areas where moisture is retained or cold conditions are retained or some sort of characteristic that the condition that the species really needs is kept over time. So we don't know, individual species are going to respond in different ways, but it's not going to look the same for every one of those tree species. And of course, this happens over long time periods. So although many common tree species are projected to have reduced habitat suitability in the future, projected to have declines, particularly under scenarios of greater warming, these are changes that will occur slowly in the absence of other stressors, not instant dieback. We do expect mature and established trees to fare better because they have those resources to call upon, and so we might be seeing impacts more at the regeneration stage. For those species that are potentially moving, have the potential to have new suitable habitat or new habitat moving into an area, we have to acknowledge that there's a really long lag time for those species to occupy habitats because they're not present and they have to find a way to essentially get into these new habitats, either naturally or through human assistance. And then the models that we use aren't able to account for competition, forest management, disturbance dynamics that happen within stands. And we know that those things can really drive species composition and what happens in a particular place. So we might expect to see changes in forest composition, particularly greatest risk of change where an ecosystem of forest is located relatively near the southern extent of the species range. Maybe where trees are projected to decline as a result of climate change and they are all on a marginal site. And so we have two factors working against them. Maybe if we have low species diversity, that certainly increases risk of any one species declining. Or if there are other factors in the forest that are reducing ecosystem function or adding stress, that's going to have a compounding effect and potentially could make those changes in forest composition happen much more quickly. We did assess the forest vulnerability across this area that we looked at for different forest communities. And so we found that different forest communities are more vulnerable, have different levels of vulnerability. And so again, when we think about all those species combined, it's those northern forests, spruce fir really dominate forests that are the most vulnerable to climate change. And then some of those more species, those ecosystems that we see farther south, like central hardwoods or fire dependent, pine, oak, scrub, pitch pine scrub oak ecosystems, having lower levels of vulnerability. So this is really broad brushstrokes across the entire region. But this can provide a really important starting point for thinking about how the forest where you are might be vulnerable or not to climate change. Some other factors that we expect to see in terms of how climate change would affect forests is through extreme events. So with more energy in the climate system, there's more extreme events. We've been seeing a lot of this already, like I said, through heavy precipitation events particularly. There's the potential for the dynamics to change for extreme events like ice storms, changing in frequency or severity or location, heat waves and droughts becoming more common, windstorms, hurricanes becoming more common, more frequent, or more intense. It's hard to pin these down because these events are not well modeled. They're rare. They're extreme events because they don't occur all the time. And so it can be really hard to pin down how much these will change and where they will happen in a particular part of the landscape. And so of course the forest vulnerability to extreme events is going to depend greatly on site conditions and the susceptibility in a particular place to a particular type of disturbance. Another interaction that we expect to see within forest ecosystems and how they interact with climate is wildfire. The climate conditions, for the reasons I talked about with those warmer, drier conditions, particularly during the growing season or warm part of the year, suggest that there's an increased risk of fire weather. So the weather that we would associate it with fire conditions. This could happen because those, like I said, warmer, drier summers. It would be exacerbated by increased stress or mortality from less suitable conditions, forests being off-site or unsuitable and stressed. Or if there's a shift towards fire-associated species like oaks and pines, to the extent that those species are able to be better adapted to future conditions, it may shift fire regimes of forest communities to allow for more frequent fire. But at the same time, wildfire may not change just because if there's spring or early summer soil moisture, that might reduce risk during some of the biggest times of the year where we see ignitions. There's a lot of regeneration of those more mesic species on the landscape that may not be so flammable or fire dependent associated right now. And then of course, there's a lot of human factors like spatial patterns of land use, land fragmentation, fire suppression. So even if we have an increase in fire weather, that might not necessarily correspond or create an increase in wildfire conditions actually occurring. Another interaction that we would see is changes in insects and disease. So we see expecting to see increased damage from forest insects and diseases. That's partly could be indirect as stress increases due to other impacts, and that increases susceptibility. So if trees are stressed from drought, then they might be more susceptible to a forest insect causing mortality. We also have the direct effects of climate change on pests and diseases. So we have things like insect pests that are able to move northward because there's a decreased likelihood of those cold lethal temperatures that kill them. So hemlock woolly adelgid, southern pine beetle are good examples of this. We also have the potential for accelerated life cycles. So instead of a forest pest having one life cycle, one generation per year, it might be able to have 2 or 3, and that would also increase the potential for it to cause damage. There's also the potential for interactions between climate change and invasive plants, when we generally expect to see increased habitat for a lot of these noxious plants. Again, indirectly, there's a potential where these plants are just going to be more competitive as our native forest ecosystems are under greater stress. And so an example of this might be if we have increases in extreme rain events, extreme hydrologic events that cause flooding, that might create opportunities for riparian area invasives to be able to move and increase across the landscape. We also have direct effects because just like with the trees we discussed earlier, these plants also have the potential for expanded ranges under warmer conditions. And so there are species like kudzu that are being observed as moving northward, partly due to climate change. And then just because these plants are really nasty, they also have increased competitiveness to be able to take advantage of elevated carbon dioxide. So invasive plants just have a lot of traits that make them highly competitive, highly adaptable. And so as we have essentially fertilized our atmosphere with additional carbon dioxide, some of these invasive plants that we have in this region or south of here are able to, it's better to take advantage of that and gobble it up. And that makes them all the more competitive. And so really when we think about climate change, one of the biggest ideas is this idea of climate change can be a threat multiplier. This term was first used by the Department of Defense in talking about climate change and how it affects world issues and world stability, but it really affects, really works when we think about ecosystems as well, because we have these compounding stressors and factors affecting ecosystems, whether it's chronic stress disturbances, pests and diseases, invasives, you know, all these different things coming together, and these interactions can really compound stress and create challenges to forest management. So we really need to be thinking about how these different things relate within a particular system. And then lastly, I'll just point out that, you know, this whole presentation that I gave was really broad brushstrokes about what's expected to happen across the region, New England, Northern New York, this big area of the Northeastern US over a really long time frame, you know, really like through the rest of this century up to the year 2100. And so that's a very big picture view. And so when you're thinking about your particular forest or the areas where you work, the site conditions and the management really matter. And so we can talk about broad trends in a lot of places, but it's really going to be those local factors that you're familiar with in the area where you work that are going to have the greatest effect. And so you're going to have a lot of knowledge about the systems where you're working, and you're going to be able to think about how when you walk in a particular woods or you think about a particular place, how is that place susceptible to all the different things that I talked about in this presentation. So thank you. How do I stop recording? Bye.